So, folks, for those of you who don't know me, I am Jim Ludis. I'm Vice President for Public Research and Initiatives at Salve Regina University and Executive Director of the Pell Center. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this virtual event tonight. Our first pandemic event was with last year's Reading Across Rhode Island author, Elizabeth Rush. And that was a moment where I can remember I dressed in full suit and dress shoes. I'm going to be honest with you, and I'm wearing sweatpants and sneakers underneath this tonight. I think that that's a reflection of the way we've all gotten a little more comfortable with working from home. But I want to thank everybody who took the time to join us tonight. And I especially want to thank Kate Lentz and everybody at Reading Across Rhode Island and the Rhode Island Center for the book. I think we've been working now with Kate for a little bit more than 3 years, and she's just quite simply a force of nature. We're grateful to work with her and with the Rhode Island Center for the book, and to be a part of this annual celebration of great storytelling and great books. So this year, already over 4,500 copies of Stamped have been delivered to libraries, classrooms, senior centers, and churches across the state. The scale and the impact of this year's Reading Across Rhode Island program would not have been possible without the Reading Across Rhode Island Committee and countless volunteers who helped this program reach into libraries, classrooms, and living rooms all across Rhode Island. Kate asked me to especially say thank you to the sponsors. So if your class, your library, your learning pod, your reading group, if any part of the state that you're a part of received a set of Stamped, it's because of the generous support of Reading Across Rhode Island sponsors: Blue Cross Blue Shield, the Equity Institute, Fidelity Investments, Nellie Mae Foundation, New Gen Capital, the Rhode Island Council for the Humanities, Rhode Island PBS, the Rhode Island Office of Library Information Services, Barton Gellman, Barrington Books, Savoy Books, the Rhode Island Library Association, and the Grimshaw Gitowich Charitable Foundation. And finally, a very special thanks to Center for the Book members whose contributions support all of its programming. So tonight we've got a really great panel that's lined up. Mayor Jorge Elorza is the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island. He's been in that role since 2015, and he's been active on issues of racial equity and justice. Valerie Tutson is a very accomplished storyteller, traveler, chronicler, and really a pioneer in a lot of respects. She is the founder. Am I getting that right, Val? She's a founding member and executive director of the Rhode Island Black Storytellers and director of Fundafest. And finally, Maureen Nagle is a middle school English teacher at Moses Brown School and a fellow graduate of Providence College. Go Friars. So to my colleagues on the panel, I want to say thank you. I'm going to stop sharing our screen here so that we can see everybody here. So folks at home, you're joining us via Facebook Live. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions of the panel tonight, but really we want to give an opportunity to everybody to be able to participate in this conversation. So if you've got a question, post it right into the comment section on Facebook Live. I'll curate these things and bring them together and be happy to put them, as many of them, to the panel as we possibly can before the night is over. So I'm going to begin, though, with just some really open-ended question that I'll put to both let's start with Maureen and the mayor, and Val. I see like maybe we're having a little connectivity issue. But to Maureen and the mayor, just your first blush reactions to Stamped, to the book, and its message about what it says. Maureen, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So Stamped was a book that was on my radar before it was published. I am a huge Jason Reynolds fan, mainly because my students love his books. He wrote the Track series that kids devour. He wrote this book, Long Way Down, that really speaks to my students, especially students who have lost loved ones. So when I heard Stamped was coming out and that they had partnered with Ibram Kendi, I was excited to read this book. So it was published the week that our schools closed last spring, right? So I got this book in the mail as life was flipped upside down. And it was even hard to find space to read. I was homeschooling kids. I was trying to teach virtually. But the book was so immediately powerful that I kind of made time for it. So for me, the book is so necessary because it fits a hole that I think exists with especially our young people. They want to know this history, and Jason Reynolds speaks it in a voice that speaks to them. It's called Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism, and You. So he cares about his audience. He wants to welcome them into some hard history. So that's kind of, the book to me, what has helped me engage with it, some uncomfortable moments of our history, and to want to share it is just that, it's important, it's powerful, it's history that a lot of it I didn't get taught in school. So I want to be able to create spaces in my classroom and to help other people create spaces where we can talk about it and discuss it and grapple with it and get uncomfortable, and see what comes of it.
Super, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, I used to be a professor before I came into politics, and I remember calling on a student one day and asked him what his impression of a book was, and his response was along these lines: "Professor, I didn't read the book, but this is how I feel about it." Which is totally unacceptable for me. So, this book is next in line for me. I will try not to channel that spirit of my former student. But I'll tell you why I'm so excited about getting to this book. And I've been reading a number of books on confronting the topic of race directly. From Isabella Wilkerson to reading about Abraham Lincoln. What I've come to just understand and grow a deeper appreciation for is that race has always been that dividing issue in our country, and it has always been dealt with by not dealing with it at all. Now, from the founding moments, it was the issue during the Constitutional Convention that stood in the way of a national constitution. Just 40 years after that, it was the issue in the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Just 35 years after that, it was the issue that led to the split into the Civil War. And then certainly it was front and center, was actively not dealt with during all of after Reconstruction, during the Jim Crow era. And that brings us to the modern day. It brings us to the Civil Rights Movement and beyond. And as we know from our lifetimes, we know that there are longstanding issues of race in our community that have still gone undealt with. And as Maureen mentioned, I think that this moment that we're living through right now really calls for us to dive in. Mm-hmm. And I'd say for a couple of reasons. The first is because, look, not dealing with race directly certainly hasn't served us any good. Look at where we are now. Race is as much of a dividing issue as it has ever been. And second, if we really care, if we truly believe in making good on this nation's promise of passing the baton to future generations so that we can form a more perfect nation, then we have to confront the most critical issues in front of us, and that is it right now. And this is it right now. The last point that I'll make before I hand it back to you, Jim, is that this issue of race, while it has always been a dividing issue in our community, it need not be that way. And in fact, we've seen through other examples, mostly in other countries, where they directly confront the issue of race, go through a national process of reconciliation, and actually, has the effect of bringing a community together. And so, I think it's about time that we not just have these uncomfortable conversations, but overcome them to a place where these divisive issues are flipped on their heads and they actually serve to bring us together to make us that more perfect nation that we're all striving towards. And I'd love to share as we go into the conversation what we're doing here in Providence to lead the nation in this conversation. But that's why I'm so excited about this book, this topic, and all the good that's going to come from it and ultimately bring us together.
Super. Mr. Mayor, so we've got a couple of folks who are mentioning on Facebook that they're having a little difficulty hearing you. I don't know if you are able to get closer to your microphone or adjust any of your settings. But I would also encourage folks, if you have trouble hearing us, you also have some control. Turn up the volume on your computer. That might help too. But Mr. Mayor will do what he can too as well. I'm also going to note that I see we seem to have some connectivity issues with Val.
You are? Because you can't see me?
We can't see you, so you might want to close out of the program and come back in. You'll just come right in, and that usually resets whatever the issue might be. So while you're doing that, so Mr. Mayor, you mentioned some of the work that you're doing, and I know that last summer, I believe, you announced an initiative to really try to take stock of Rhode Island's historic role with the slave trade, and as a first step, I believe, towards considering some proposal for reparations. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and what that where that initiative stands and where your thinking is on that now? Are you muted? Let's see here. In the lower left-hand corner, can you click the mute or unmute button? There you go.
All right. So I'm on phone audio. You should hear me a lot clearer now.
You're much better now.
All right. That's great. So thank you for that. Thank you for that question, Jim. Yes, we've been doing a lot of work in this space. And in fact, Valerie Tutson, one of our co-panelists, has been a big part of that work. So, what I've been doing over the past 8 months now is every single week I meet with, a group of anywhere from 80 to 100 different leaders in the Black community. And we've created this forum where they set the agenda and they set the priorities. We've done things such as launched an initiative to change the state's name, talk about, shooting high and building on the work that's been done in the past and more work that's been done this year. We put the question to voters and it actually passed. And so now officially the state has a new name. It dropped Providence Plantations. And as we went into the conversation, the more and more I came to fully appreciate that the wounds run very deep. And if we really want to make progress in this moment, then we got to go to the source. And that's what led me to announce and to launch this process of truth, reconciliation, and reparations. So there are 3 phases, and each one of them is as important as the other. The first one begins with, we brought in historical societies and some researchers, and they're going to chronicle the 400 years of racial treatment in our city and put it forward in a very accessible way that connects the past to the present. So that's in the process of being done, and that should be ready within a month. And so once we have the truth, then we're going to launch a process of reconciliation. And it's my belief that we all have this moral instinct inside of us. And when we're confronted with just patent unfairness and injustice, that instinct kicks in and we want to be part of the solution. And I do believe that this reconciliation, in the spirit of healing deep wounds and bringing people together, is going to have that unifying influence in our community. And then as we go through that reconciliation process, we don't just want to serve the table. We also want to take it that next step. And we're going to launch a process of municipal reparations. Again, reparations can take a lot of different forms, but I'm not so focused on what shape it's going to take. I'm more focused on the process to get there. We are empowering and amplifying the voice of leaders in the Black community so that they can set the agenda and set the priorities. And we'll have a committee, and they'll make recommendations of what the most appropriate form of municipal recommendations are, given the harms of the past and the process that we all went through. And that's how we want to make sure that we're healing these deep wounds, by going directly to the source and making sure that we're establishing a foundation that's going to lead to important work in confronting the race issue in our city long after this process is complete. So that's what we've been doing, and I can tell you that there's no other city in the country that's doing it just like this. And I got to say, not to brag or boast about the folks that we have at the table doing this work, but it really is nation-leading work, and other cities are turning to us and asking us how they can launch something similar in their places as well.
It's exciting work too, and there's a lot of interest in it in the questions and comments on Facebook. So maybe we'll get a chance to come to those in just a moment. Val, so we've resolved the gremlins in the system. I'm glad that you're able to hop in, but we had to gloss over you, and that first question was really simply your personal reactions to Stamped. Tell us what, in encountering this text, what your reactions were.
Well, I was really happy to read the book. I have to say I didn't know anything about it, unlike Maureen. I wasn't familiar with Jason Reynolds, and I hadn't been able to, with a toddler, get to Ibram X. Kendi's big fat book about it. And I got to say that the very first sentence in the introduction drew me in, which is, that the past is the present and the present is you. And to me, that is so much related to why I do storytelling and why I like to tell stories that come from history. For me, when we're engaged in storytelling, and I think about that as a little bit differently from narrative, and we can talk about that at another point or in this somewhere, but story collapses the past and present in this moment, right? Because we're sitting here in this time, but we're traveling back. And that's really powerful to me. When I was growing up, similar to some of the things that the mayor was alluding to, I was learning history. I hated history when I was in school. Hated it because I never saw myself. But my mother, who was white, by the way, knew that her little brown biracial kids were growing up in a white community. My dad, who was Black, worked in a city. So we would often say my dad had no idea where his children were growing up. Plus, he grew up in Black schools and he went to Howard. Like Black history and Black folks were always around him. But my mother was very intentional about bringing Black books home to us. One of the things, and I think this also jumped out at me as I was responding to this book, is that so many of our stories have that framing around slavery and enslavement. And so that's the piece that that I know that I wrestle with even today. Like, it's important for us to see this, but I always knew that there's even something more to that. I was so grateful to get the Black heroes and learn more about what Black people have always been doing. But I also know that there's so much more to the experience of Black folks on this planet.
Maureen, you and I were talking a little bit before we started here, and well, I think this book is remarkable for the way that it is very accessible. You're a middle school teacher. What are the unique challenges that you face in teaching this book to your students?
Great question. So, one of the first things that Jason Reynolds tells us is this is not a history book, because I think there are a lot of students like Val who have maybe struggled through their history courses, maybe because they haven't seen themselves in history books. So it's what inspires me to, find a variety of narratives to inspire students to want to read books because they can see themselves or see others. But the difficulties are many. When I, about 10 years ago, I've been in teaching for about 20 years now. And 10 years ago, I was teaching To Kill a Mockingbird. And we finished the book, and we were talking about the challenges of this book and how there is a white savior narrative, right, with Atticus. And I had one student who shared, well, Maureen, we don't have to worry about this anymore because the civil rights movement solved this. And that was the pause for me. That was the moment that has stuck with me, right, and really has compelled me to do a lot of work to figure out how do we bring the history, the whole history, not just one person's or one race's view of the history. How do we bring a more comprehensive history to our students through stories, through narratives, where they can grapple and wrestle and get uncomfortable. And that probably is one of the hardest parts of the work, is that this is a whole book about the history of racism and slavery, and it's uncomfortable. And to really do the work, you have to see yourself in the work. And sometimes that can be hard to really see some deep truths about who we are and where we've come from. So, I'd say that's probably the most difficult part, is creating a space where kids can feel comfortable asking hard questions, because their biggest worry, and this comes up every year early on in any sort of book where race is a theme and where we're going to have some, talk about our identity. Their biggest worry is that I don't want to speak because I'm afraid of saying something racist. I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. And it comes from a place of kindness. They don't want to hurt each other. They don't want to offend someone. But kind of going back to what Mayor Elorza said, if we are quiet, if we are silent, we are not solving problems. And just last week, we got to celebrate Amanda Gorman, the inaugural poet. I hope you have seen her. To any of our audience, if you haven't watched her perform that poem, I hope you will. And for my students, we watched it, we took it in, we celebrated her work, and then we had a couple of days of discussion around their favorite lines. And for my students, one line that really stuck with them was, "Quiet isn't always peace." And we've sat with that for a while as we think about this book and what anti-racism means, what bystanderism means, and if we can find ourselves in the work and get uncomfortable and do this together, I think it inspires kids to not be quiet and to make sure that they can find a voice so that they can create peace. They want to. I know this about our youth. They want to be part of the solution, but we as adults have to sit there with them and get uncomfortable. And that's hard work. But if we do it together, we figure it out.
So folks who are with us on Facebook, I want to remind you that if you've got a question that you'd like to put to the panel, to please type that into the comment section. I'm not going to monopolize all of our time tonight, but I do want to ask just a couple more questions, and then we'll turn to the public. But if you've got a question, no need to wait. Go ahead and post that into Facebook Live. Mr. Mayor, Maureen's point about, I think everybody here has talked about how this is, in some respects, a difficult history to understand and process. One of the things that one of the things that I do at the Pell Center is I host Story in the Public Square, and in the immediate aftermath of the election of President Trump, we noticed a diversity in the guests that we had. The election of President Trump. We noticed the diversity in the guests coming on. Those who would explain it as a racist reaction to the election of Barack Obama in his 8 years in office, and those who rejected that assertion out of hand. I'm wondering, as a public leader, how you bridge that divide, how you bridge that that gap in the public. You're the mayor of a remarkably diverse city. How do you bridge that divide to have these kinds of conversations so that they turn out to be productive at the end?
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million question, Jim. And we're all working as we with the tools that we have to try to bridge that gap and bring people together. I do believe that there was a reaction to the election of President Obama, and you see how immigration just began to be a wedge issue. The ultimate tribal, us versus them, in group versus out group. And from the very beginning, Donald Trump's message was that, we are in the in group and our country is being taken away from us. And so when you have someone with such a prominent voice, such a prominent platform continuing to spread that message, I'll tell you honestly, Jim, it's been very hard on our community. It seems as though those folks who would, harbor some racial or ethnic resentment, they kept it quiet or kept it to themselves among their groups. But something about President Trump trumpeting this allowed them to feel comfortable stepping out of the shadows and making their voices heard. So I think of two things. On the one hand, I do believe that you have to speak to people's hearts and minds. When we speak to people's hearts, there are these just fundamental values that we all stand by, And there are promises that we have committed to as a country from our very founding, principles such as equality and justice, and that we're all equal and under the law, that there's this inherent dignity in every human being. And I think it's important for us to continue to communicate that message, especially in light of strong messages from the other side that try to devalue and dehumanize the people in front of us. So I think that speaking to people's hearts is incredibly important, perhaps never more important than what we just experienced these past few years. But you also got to speak to people's heads, and help people rationalize and think through why this makes sense. And I think of one of my favorite legal scholars, Professor Derek Bell, who passed away a couple years ago. He wrote about race issues, and he wrote about it in a very real politic kind of way. And he made the very provocative claim that just about all of the gains made by the Black community in terms of civil rights in this country have come when their interests temporarily converged with those of the broader white community. And and he makes a compelling case that if there's a way that we can just broaden the tent, bring more people into the coalition, and make more people feel as though us moving forward means that our entire community progresses. If we can sort of make that message resonate with folks, then I think we can make even more progress. And that's what we've tried to do. It came to a head, I think, most pointedly in Providence around the topic of undocumented immigrants in sanctuary cities. And the case we would try to make is that we're all safer when undocumented immigrants don't have to hide in the shadows and feel comfortable calling the police when someone is victimized. We're all safer when they have access to driver's licenses and can can get a license and get insurance for their cars. So that's the topic of immigration. That's the wedge that President Trump tried to drive, but he did the same thing on race. And as we explore these next steps, as I mentioned, going through the reconciliation process and then the reparations process, the case that we've been making is that this is not about special favors for a group, for an undeserving group. Let's abandon that idea from the very beginning. This is investments that we're making in our own community, right? We're talking about individuals that are part of us, part of our team, as much as anyone else that lives in our community, and an investment in this community that has been left behind and has been the subject of the most vile and gruesome discrimination in our history. This is an investment in ourselves as well. So you try to bridge that gap by speaking to people's minds and hearts and minds, and we'll just stick with that to bring as many people into the fold as possible.
Hey, Val, that sort of leads me back to something that you said earlier about the power of storytelling and narrative. How can we use stories? How can we use narrative to do what the mayor is describing and appeal to both people's hearts and their minds?
Well, I think that that's exactly what storytelling does, right? And part of the reason why it works so well in this time, or really any time, and in relationship to a book like this, which gives us, some timeline where we get to see some things repeated. But if you hear the story of a real person and you get to go along in their journey, one of my favorite stories to tell is of a woman by the name of Elizabeth Freeman in Massachusetts, who, was wounded by the woman who was her quote unquote mistress, right? And it was right after the American Revolution. She'd heard the Declaration of Independence. She'd been there for the Massachusetts Constitution. And she'd heard these words that all men are created equal. And she wanted that, right? So when I get to tell her story, everybody gets to go along and see that she's protecting her daughter from violence. They can see that she's standing up for herself and her daughter and her future. And when it's in that embodiment that is real for people, I think also for someone like me who didn't like history, then I want to know more about the historical context. I might not get all the dates right or all the correct words, but at least I have a better understanding that because she went to court, eventually slavery was abolished in Massachusetts, right? So it's that story. We are hardwired for storytelling. It is a full body experience as opposed to something that's flat on a page. And I was just listening to a colleague of mine, her name is Laura Packer, talk about storytelling. And it was it was kind of like this, right? She was saying, humans have been telling stories as long as we've been on the planet. So that means way before they were ever written down, and certainly way before they were translated in this technological medium. And we tell them because they help us know who we are, whose we are, and how we really connect to one another in the human family. That's where we see how we're connected, as well as what makes us different. But it's not necessarily as off-putting, right? Because you're different, but you're still human. You're still me, right? When you hear a story, you imagine yourself in that story, and that's where connections are made.
That's a great transition, I think, to the questions that we've gotten from the folks on Facebook Live. We've got I see close to 40 questions that are posted. We'll get to as many as we possibly can. The first is from Barbara, and it's to you, Maureen. What's the youngest grade level that you would recommend this book for independent reading? Would you agree that students in elementary and middle school should read this book with the guidance from their teachers?
So the publisher for this book, I do think seventh grade. If I was going to teach it in a classroom, I think seventh grade and up, it could work really well. I have two young daughters who are 6 and 9. So we read books. We have books all over the house, right? And we're constantly picking and choosing different things to read. So I have shared excerpts with them. You know, they find books and pick them up, and we'll talk about them. But I think in a school, I think if you're going to teach the whole book, I think seventh grade and up would be my recommendation.
Super. Mr. Mayor, a question from Bernadette Baker, who asks, what kind of programs exist for children who are traumatized by racism? She notes that racism is a disease that they live with daily. Are there programs that offer them any sort of assistance for dealing with that trauma?
That's a great question, and the answer is that yes and no. There are some resources, and over the past several years, we've increased the investment of mental health counselors inside of our schools, and we've also integrated mindfulness into many of our elementary schools, and just allows students to process their thoughts rather than hold it up inside, and sort of one day the pressure builds and it explodes. So we've made these investments, but we also know that, we don't have these investments at the scale that they're required. Many of our kids, have experienced significant trauma, and it goes untreated. And we know that we need to invest more. So what we've begun to do is, we've also provided more wraparound services in our recreation centers. Pre-COVID, when they were open, making sure that young people have, caring adults that are going to steer them in the right direction and are there to listen to some of their concerns. While at the same time, we work with a number of providers outside of school to make sure that kids feel supported. And the last thing that we want is for the quote unquote kid to slip through the cracks. We want every single child to be surrounded by caring adults that can spot the issues as they're emerging, and then refer a child, and sometimes the child and their family, to the kind of supports and services that they need to overcome it and get through it. So, we've recognized that need, and we've moved to fill some of that need. But I certainly look forward to working in the coming years to provide even more supports.
Super. Maureen, I look at some of these questions, and a lot of them, and maybe both Maureen and Val might be able to respond to this, but a number of the comments and questions are about the fact that this book can make the reader uncomfortable. And I guess let's start maybe with Val from the storytelling perspective, and then with Maureen from the teaching perspective. What does that discomfort offer us as both the reader, as the audience, and then ultimately as a student? Val, let's start with you.
Well, I'd like to talk about that also in relation to the trauma.
Sure.
Again, talking from my own experience as a Black kid in a school with predominantly, white teachers and white kids in the classroom, when you're dealing with this kind of stuff, that can add trauma if you don't have that right surrounding about it. So one of the things that we at the Rhode Island Black Storytellers, feel really strongly about is making sure that kids are not just getting the traumatic history that can make you mad, furious, and rightly so, but what are the other things that show our full humanity. And I think that is so important. And it kind of goes back to one of the things that I was saying before, which is that this is great because it gives, the founding of our country and the wound of racism that we've had from the beginning. But what I like to do and have always done, from telling the stories during the time of slavery and the hard stories, I always would ground it in Africa first, always, so that everybody, white people, Black people, whoever the group is, understands that this trauma, 600 years old from the time of, the slave trade or colonialism, is this much time in the experience of Black people on this planet. And that even as we are looking at hard things, there's survival that is in us. And there is a way of being in the world that has come, even if you couldn't pack your bag to get here, right? I often will start with a song that comes from Africa or wear something like this so that we are reminded that there is so much more than we can touch on this surface. And that if we put it in that context, for a Black kid to be in that conversation, it's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Maureen, from the student's perspective?
Yes. Everything Val said. Everything. And I would say for me, I do not take this work lightly. When that moment hit about 10 years ago of saying, wow, like this, a student having a perception that we have solved any racial inequities with the civil rights, in the 1960s, right? We have some work to do. So that was a time for me to do the work, especially as a white woman who teaches a diverse student population, understanding this myself, right? And how I see myself as a white person, how I walk through the world as a white person, how that is different to other people because of my race. I grew up at a time in the 1980s where we were colorblind, right? Where my friend had a shirt that said colorblind. And I thought that was the coolest thing, that if we were truly equal, we didn't see race. And so it is a journey of our lives for some of us to try to figure out what is my race? How does it affect my experience? Because I couldn't do this work if I didn't understand that about myself. Because in doing the hardest of hard work, we have to be our authentic selves. We have to truly know who we are to be able to have those kind of important conversations with students. So for me, it was personal research, right? That kind of deep reflection, and also professional development. So at some point tonight, I'll share a ton of programming that we have developed around this book, because our hope is that this evening inspires you to read the book, to check it out. But maybe you do want to teach it in your class. Maybe you're curious about reading it with a book club or bringing it to a community group or a church group. But again, that's hard work, and we wanted to provide a lot of resources to support you in that, because we don't want to inflict more trauma, right? That is purpose number one of this work.
Thanks, Maureen. Mr. Mayor, there's a couple of questions here. Pamela asks one in particular about whether or not the work that you're doing for both establishing an understanding of what the history is, but also looking at how do we move forward from that knowledge. Is that something that she asks whether or not it's something that's adaptable to other cities and other polities across the country? But I'm going to go one step further and ask, do you get questions from your fellow mayors about this kind of work?
Yes and yes. It absolutely is adaptable. And I've held a number of Zoom calls where mayors have been interested in how do you launch reparation conversations in your home communities, and how do we as mayors coordinate the work that we're doing so that we can elevate this conversation to higher levels of government and bring other institutions into it as well. So there's a lot of interest in moving this forward. But I will say that there's also a lot of people have genuine questions, and sometimes just at a personal level, people are scared to wade into the race issue. And that's because historically it has been a dividing line. It has been something that divides us. It doesn't have to be, but the reality is that historically it has been. And I've had mayors express to me that they're concerned about taking this on, and what credibility do they have to be the champion on these issues if they're middle class white and they just don't have the background in this? What standing do they have to move this forward? And part of the conversation that I've had with them is that this is a moment that calls for all allies to gather up, to group up, and to work together. Along these same lines, I wanted to just underscore and speak a little on something that Val and both Maureen touched on, and it's this important point that the history of the Black community in America is not the history of slavery and discrimination in America. As my friend Keith Stokes makes the point he makes so well, the story of Black folks in America is a story of overcoming challenges such as slavery and discrimination in America and still standing and moving forward today. So that's the story of Black folks in this country, which is really an amazing one. And so, as you think about, all of the horrible things that have been done to the Black community, if you look at it with that lens, that the worse things have been, the deeper the appreciation that you have for the Black community and their capacity, their ability to overcome all of this and still become the best versions of themselves. It really is a testament to the strength of the community. It's no less upsetting, and what happens in the past shouldn't horrify us any less. But it really makes you just have an even deeper appreciation for the resilience in the Black community.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Maureen, Peter asks a question that touches on something that you and I talked about earlier privately, which is that there are elements of when I read the book, I was struck particularly by the claimed link between the existence of American slavery and the American Revolutionary War. And I spent a fair amount of time over the last couple of days sort of checking in with my historian colleagues at sort of universities scattered across the United States to say, hey, where are we on this? And it's complicated. And it's not quite what the author portrays. So the question that Peter asks is, do we teach this content, the content in Stamped, as an interpretation or as history as it's presented in the book?
I'm so glad you asked that because I loved that conversation that we had earlier. And, when this book first came out and I got excited about it because I thought it would really speak to kids, when my approach to teaching is very collaborative. So it is rare that I will simply take something and then bring it straight to the classroom. I reach out to colleagues. So this summer, I would Zoom with my fellow English teacher at school and our history teachers to talk about this book and to think about what is the content that we would be sharing with kids? How do we frame it in a way that encourages their critical thinking about the topic, that we're not offering it as gospel, but as a framework for understanding complicated issues. So, for example, in the classroom, we're reading the novel by chapter. There's an excellent resource guide that the publisher put out that I've been using, and we'll stop and reflect on it. And I'll ask students questions like, what topics deeply interest you that you want to research further so that they are driving their own learning? And I ask them, what questions do you have, right? Like, what's on your mind? How are you experiencing this? And then lastly, what's worrying you? What's concerning you? What isn't quite jiving with you? And I would say I'm in the middle of teaching the book now, and kids are totally engaged in this content. And yes, to Peter, they'll push back, right? They ask questions, but why is that? But how is that? That's not how I learned it. And I love that, right? Like, I welcome that. Kids should have a space where they can critique. So I think as long as you're teaching it in a way that allows for that critical thinking and critique, and to see it as a framework, to me, it is a valuable resource for kids to learn how to do that.
Thanks, Maureen. And I got to say that the discussion in Facebook Live, there's a lot of back and forth between folks. I think the three of you have made a lot of fans tonight for people who maybe didn't know you before. So I want to thank everybody for that rich dialogue that's taking place there as well. Val, one of the questions that people have raised is, how do you tell these stories to elementary aged students? I know that we've got a number of teachers in the audience tonight who are really mindful of how do you actually engage with students at a younger level. I'm curious, from your perspective as a storyteller, how do you tell these kinds of stories to younger audiences?
I think you tell them truthfully. When I first started telling stories and was doing a program on the Underground Railroad, initially I thought it should be 5th grade and up, and then I would do it 3rd grade and up. Other times people would say, we want our whole group to come. And again, because they are true stories about real people, you got to give a little more space for them to ask questions and to answer them. And certainly, pick and choose which stories you're going to tell to the younger ones, but they can handle it. I mean, I first learned about slavery when I was 8 years old, that I have a vivid memory of learning about Harriet Tubman at that time, and about the time of the Underground Railroad. And so, and when Rochelle Garner Coleman and I did a program on the civil rights movement, same sort of thing. We did it at the Children's Museum. We still, have done it for years and years. And that's really young kids, but they're getting introduced to these ideas. They don't get everything, but they get enough. They get enough, and then they hear it again when they're a little bit older, and they get a little bit more. So I think, we don't want to kill them with the gore, but we want to tell them the truth. And people of color have always had to tell their children the truth, which isn't pretty. So, it helps us all learn early on what the truth is and how to make a difference when we're older.
Yeah, I'm mindful of the song in the South Pacific, "You've got to be carefully taught." I will not sing tonight, but but it's a powerful message, and it's a powerful story that persists across time. Maureen, can you give us a little background about why did the Rhode Island Center for the Book select Stamped? In case it's not apparently powerfully obvious, well, what was the genesis for selecting this book this year?
I'd love to. Well, first of all, there were a ton of great books, right? So I am a volunteer for the Rhode Island Center for the Book. I'm on the nominating committee, and we read tons of books. We are, I have all of my reading friends, right? They're passing me books that we are talking about. This one rose to the surface because of 2020. We were coming out of a really hard year that it still feels like I'm in a really hard year, right? Like this just feels like a continuation of that. And we wanted to find a book that would speak to some of that, right? That the purpose of the Read Across Rhode Island program is to bring Rhode Islanders together around a book that speaks to them and where we are as a state today. And when we are coming out of 2020 and we see we are learning about George Floyd, and we are living the injustice, and we are seeing it, and I have students wondering, what am I doing? What can I do, Maureen? This is the book that will create the conversations that kids want to have. And one of our goals too is to offer an intergenerational programming. So, as a teacher, I'm certainly focused on my students. They are my passion. They drive everything I do. But really at the Center for the Book, we're thinking about all generations of Rhode Islanders. And we thought that this book could be something that would inspire the conversations about reparations that the mayor is trying to get us into, right? That it's through storytelling, right? That Val knows the power of that storytelling to get us thinking and wondering and talking about something that too many of us don't want to. And we thought this was the right year for this book.
It's hard to argue with that, Mr. Mayor. We're running out of time here, but I wanted to ask you if you are a citizen, whether of your city in Providence or someplace else in the state or anywhere in the United States. If you're a citizen and you care about these issues, what can you do to be involved in moving this agenda forward?
Well, definitely, if you're a resident of Providence, we're going to begin the reconciliation process of the truth, reconciliation, and reparations sometime soon, and we need everyone to be part of that conversation. Part of this is an understanding that the city can't do it alone. We need every institution, every company, every organization to have these conversations and to elevate these issues right to the very top of their priority list. So being part of the conversation. And to add a bit to Maureen's point, and how we educate the next generation, it's so important that we emphasize this point that the history isn't just a thing of the past. It's something that actively shapes the present and sets the stage for the future. And so as we go through this truth-telling process, we're going to have a document or a digital document that's going to span these 400 years of history. And we're also thinking proactively about how do we convert that into a curriculum that can be integrated into our public education and into education more generally, and that kids receive out of school as well. So, we want to be very forward-thinking and proactive. And how do we tailor this message so that it resonates with our kids? And then last but not least, we also have to personalize it, as Val Tutson, said so clearly. There are many families that still live in our community today that were personally impacted by redlining, blockbusting, urban renewal, quote unquote, Negro removal throughout our city. And so connecting these challenges of history to actual people and families that were impacted by it and still live in our community is going to be an important way that we drive this home and personalize it so that it really resonates with our kids throughout the city.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Val, I don't know if you're able to speak to this, but there are a couple questions about sort of what the rest of the Reading Across Rhode Island agenda looks like for the rest of this year, and in particular, whether or not there will be an event with the authors.
Well, I can say some things. Maureen might be able to say it a little bit better. But yes, there's a partnership with Rhode Island PBS. So there are something like 3 Tuesday nights. Maureen, give me the thumbs up if I'm
Yes,
I'm
you
trying
got
to
it.
remember. So folks can join in and get, some more in-depth tools for how to use this book in their classrooms. And there will be a Zoom event with Jason Reynolds in April. So yes, these things are happening. And also Living Literature is in the process of putting together a program that will also be available for schools and libraries to bring the actual text of the book to life. So there are lots of ways that folks can engage. And I think they can go to Rari, how do you call it? Rari, R-A-R-I, something or other.
Yes.
All the things you need.
Yes. Can I
Super.
follow up on that, Jim?
Yeah,
Is that
please
okay?
go ahead, Maureen. Yeah, absolutely.
So, like Val said, all of the, we have a ton of programming, more than ever before, because the book is so good and we thought it would inspire a lot of conversation. If you go to ribook.org, you'll find links to all the events that we have. Jason Reynolds himself is Zooming with Rhode Island on April 8th, and registration just went live. So you can find the link there to register. And like Val said, we have a series of evening sessions on February 2nd, February 9th, and February 23rd. There are 3 Tuesdays in February. And we have Rhode Island PBS, a Rhode Island PBS all-star teacher named Crystal Montero, Mary Barden from NEARI, for the first night to specifically help teachers who want to teach the book prepare themselves for using it. So that's a great event for teachers. And then at the second one, we have teachers who are currently teaching the book in conversation about how they're using it. And we also have that night on the 9th, Diversity Talks and Equity Institute. So anyone who's interested in bringing anti-racist, anti-bias professional development to their school or to their business, that's a great evening to attend. And then the Rhode Island Black Storytellers will be with us for the final session, also with Gen Z, because students are at the heart of what we do. So we'll have some students talking about their actions that they're taking for anti-racism work around the state.
And I got to tell you, there have been tremendous resources and links posted to the comment section on Facebook Live. So if you're just watching the video, scan your eyes over to the right there and actually take a look at what's going on there, because there's great resources there from the Rhode Island Center for the book about all of the opportunities, including some of the curriculum that's been developed to support teaching this book this year. So, folks, go ahead, Val.
I just want to put a shout out to our Funda Festival. We did kick this off on Saturday. We talked about the book, and one of the things that we do at the Black Storytellers is, again, we try to give a broad perspective around Black stories and experience. So check out fundafest23.com and come join us this coming weekend. We got lots of awesome things happening.
Well, Val, thank you. And I want to thank all of our speakers tonight. Mayor Elorza, Maureen Nagle, Val Tutson, thank you so much for being with us. And for those of you at home, thank you for being a part of this kickoff of Reading Across Rhode Island. We're thrilled to be able to spend some time with you, and we'll look forward to seeing you down the road. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Jim.
Jim.
Everyone.
Thanks, Mayor. Thanks, Maureen. That was fun.
Hi, Mayor. That was really fun. Thank you.
That was nice.